After watching these stories, don't forget to write what you would have done in the main character's place. Now, let's move on to the stories. Around midnight, James finishes restocking the shelves and decides to take a break. He sits in the staff room, where there's a small couch and a microwave. On the table lies his meal, a sandwich and a bottle of water. He turns on his phone to check messages, but suddenly, he hears something strange. In the distance, there's a sound, like someone pushing a cart. James tenses up. The store is closed to customers, and no one but him should be inside. He steps out of the room and looks around. The hallway leading to the main floor is dark, with only a faint light seeping through the glass doors. James moves closer to the doors and peers inside. A shopping cart stands in the middle of the store, as if someone just abandoned it. He approaches and notices something odd resting in the cart, an old backpack, covered in dirt. James has never seen anything like this in the store. He picks it up and examines it. Suddenly, a small note falls out. It reads, "They're here." James feels his heart start to race. He puts the backpack back on the cart and glances around. The store appears empty, but he has the unsettling feeling that someone is watching him. He decides to return to the staff room, but then, a voice, "James." Someone whispers from the dark end of the store. He turns, but sees nothing. The voice comes again, this time closer. "James, can you hear me?" Cold sweat forms on his back as he reaches for the store's light switch, but it doesn't work. Suddenly, footsteps sound behind him. He spins around and sees a shadow moving toward him. James bolts for the exit, but the doors are locked. He pulls at them, but they won't budge. The footsteps grow nearer. He turns again and sees a figure just a few meters away. A man in a dark hooded jacket, his face obscured. In his hand, a knife. "You weren't supposed to see that," the man says in a low, chilling voice. Panic floods James's body. He squeezes his eyes shut and screams. When he opens them again, the man is gone. The store lights flicker back on. The doors unlock. He stands there, breathing heavily, trying to comprehend what just happened. The next 10 to 15 minutes, James struggles to calm himself. Maybe it was just a hallucination, exhaustion playing tricks on him, but the backpack and the note are still there. He picks up the note again and notices something on the back, a map of the store, with a mark in one of the corners. Following the clue feels reckless, but he can't just ignore it. Grabbing a flashlight, he makes his way to the marked spot, the basement storage, where extra stock is kept. The stairs creak under his weight as he descends. The air is damp and cold. He turns on his flashlight and scans the room. Boxes and old carts clutter the space. Then, a whisper, "You're getting closer." The voice comes from a dark corner. James steps forward and sees something chilling, a symbol drawn on the wall, a circle filled with strange markings. Below it, another note, "They're waiting for you." His heart pounds. This is no joke. Something is deeply wrong with this place. He turns to leave, but the basement door slams shut behind him. Footsteps. He spins around. The hooded man is there, standing in the shadows, his face still hidden. The knife glints in his hand. "You shouldn't have come down here," the man says, stepping forward. James is frozen. He's trapped. He needs to think fast, or he might not get out of here alive. "Do you know what's happening here?" the man asks, his voice cold and emotionless. James says nothing, his mind racing. He has to act now. Because if he doesn't, he may never leave this basement. James feels his heart pounding so hard it seems like it might burst from his chest. The hooded man stands just a few steps away, the knife in his hand glinting in the flashlight's beam. The air in the basement grows even colder, and the silence is so thick that James can hear every one of his breaths. "You weren't supposed to see this," the man repeats, his voice eerily calm. "But now you're here. And you're not leaving." James glances around, searching for any way to escape. The basement is cluttered with boxes, old carts, and other junk. He spots a large metal pipe lying nearby. Silently counting the seconds, he makes a sudden move, grabs the pipe, and hurls it at the man. Instinctively, the man dodges, and James uses the moment to sprint toward the door. The door is locked, but he slams his shoulder against it with all his strength. It doesn't budge. Behind him, he hears footsteps. The man is approaching. James grabs a heavy metal crowbar lying nearby and smashes it against the lock with all his might. With a dull crack, the door bursts open. He dashes upstairs, but behind him, a voice yells, "You won't escape." James runs into the store's main hall, But suddenly, he stops. Another note lies on the floor. He picks it up and reads, "They're in the fridge." His eyes instinctively move toward the large refrigeration units where food is stored. A cold sweat trickles down his spine as he steps toward one of them. He opens the fridge door. Inside, there's nothing but boxes and packages. But then, he hears a faint tapping. It seems to be coming from another unit. James approaches it and pulls the door open. Inside, he sees something that makes his blood run cold. In the corner of the fridge, a little girl sits with her hands and feet tied, her mouth covered with duct tape. Her eyes are filled with tears and terror. She looks at James as if silently begging for help. "You found her," a voice says behind him. James turns around and sees the hooded man standing just a few steps away, the knife still in his hand. "She's one of many," the man says. "But you weren't supposed to see her." James realizes he has stumbled onto something far bigger than he ever imagined. This isn't just a lone psychopath, this is part of something much darker happening inside this store. He has to save the girl, but how? The man steps closer, and James knows he has no choice. He grabs the nearest heavy object, a large can of food, and hurls it at the man. The man flinches, and James uses the moment to rush to the girl. He quickly unties her and pulls her out of the fridge. "Hold on to me," he whispers, and they run toward the exit, but the door is locked again. The hooded man stands behind them, and now his face is visible. He looks like an ordinary man, but his eyes are filled with cold cruelty. "You won't get out of here," he says. James knows he only has one chance. He grabs a fire extinguisher from the wall and slams it against the glass entrance doors of the store. The glass cracks but doesn't break. The man laughs, stepping closer. "You think that will help?" he sneers. James doesn't stop. He swings again, and again. Finally, the glass shatters just enough for him to push the girl outside. "Run!" he shouts. "Find help." The girl nods and disappears into the darkness. James turns to face the man, who is now just a few steps away. "You think you've won?" the man asks. "You don't know anything." James realizes he can't escape, but he can stall the man long enough for the girl to get away. He swings the fire extinguisher with all his strength, hitting the man and knocking him to the floor, but the man quickly gets back up. "You'll die here," he says, advancing again. Suddenly, from outside, the blare of police sirens fills the air. The man freezes, his face twisting in rage. Next time, he hisses before turning and vanishing into the darkness of the basement. James collapses onto the floor, his body trembling with adrenaline. Moments later, police officers storm the store. They find James barely standing and the little girl waiting outside. The next day, James wakes up in the hospital. The police tell him they searched the store's basement, but it was empty. No sign of the hooded man. The girl he rescued doesn't remember how she ended up in the fridge. She only recalls being taken by a man in a mask. James realizes he's stumbled onto something far bigger than he ever imagined. The Aldi store is shut down for investigation, but no one knows what really happened there. As James leaves the hospital, he receives a message on his phone. It's a photo, an image of the store's basement. On the wall, scrawled in red, are the words, "We will find you." He stares at the screen, feeling the icy grip of fear all over again. This isn't over. Rose had loved large stores since childhood. She was enchanted by the idea of endless aisles of products, massive refrigerators filled with milk and cold drinks, and packages that could last for months. But now, at 18 and working the night shift at Costco, the charm of these places had faded. Night shifts were both simple and exhausting. Fewer customers, less hustle, but also more work, restocking items, checking expiration dates, helping the rare customers who wandered between the aisles like ghosts. This night began like any other. By 10 o'clock, the number of shoppers had decreased significantly, and by 11, the store was almost empty. Only a few people remained: a young man who was taking his time choosing beer by the refrigerators, a middle-aged woman who seemed to be stocking up for the entire month, and an elderly man quietly examining the cheese selection. But there was one more person. Rose noticed him by chance as she walked between the aisles with boxes of baby food. He was a man in a dark hooded jacket. He stood in front of the shelves with jars of puree and bottles of baby milk, examining them with unusual attention. At first, Rose thought he was just a father trying to find the right product for his child. But something about him was strange. He didn't look like an ordinary shopper. No cart, no basket. He was just standing there, staring at the shelves as if he didn't know what he needed. His fingers nervously brushed over the jars, then abruptly pulled away. Rose wasn't one to panic easily, but there was something unsettling about him. Suppressing her inner unease, she approached him. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, trying to sound friendly. The man slowly turned his head. His face was partially hidden by the hood, but Rose noticed sharp cheekbones, deep dark eyes, and a light stubble. He smiled, but it was an odd, tense smile, as if stretched across his face. "No, thank you," he replied in a low, quiet voice. Rose nodded and stepped back, but she decided to keep an eye on him. After a few minutes, he picked up several jars of puree, hesitated for a moment, and slowly walked toward the toy department. That was already strange. He didn't look like a father but more like someone trying to pretend to be a father. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. The toy section during the night shift looked eerie. Dolls on the shelves, plastic cars, stuffed bears, all stood in silence, illuminated only by dim overhead lights. The man walked between the aisles and stopped in front of a shelf filled with dolls. Rose cautiously moved closer, hiding behind a nearby shelf. He picked up a large doll in a pink dress, inspected it from all sides, and ran his finger over its plastic face. Rose felt her hands grow cold. Something was off. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera to discreetly take a picture of him, but just as she pressed the button, the man suddenly turned his head and looked directly at her. Their eyes met, his eyes darkened, and his lips curled into an almost imperceptible smile. Rose felt her heart race. He knew she was watching him, and it seemed he liked it. Rose felt her fingers tighten around the phone, but she couldn't take her eyes off the stranger. His smile remained tense, almost unnatural. He slowly placed the doll back on the shelf, but his eyes never left her. It felt like time had stopped. Rose tried to act calm. She pretended to be passing by and took a few steps back toward the checkout. The man remained still. He stood between the aisles, almost invisible in the shadows of the tall shelves. Something about him stirred a primal fear within her. It wasn't just anxiety or ordinary suspicion, it was a real sense of danger that sent chills down her spine. She pulled out her phone and pretended to scroll through it, actually turning on the camera to try and take another picture. But when she looked up again, the man was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. He had vanished. Rose glanced around, trying to locate him. He could have gone to the exit, but for some reason, she felt he was still nearby. She decided to return to the checkout, where her colleague Emma was. The short brunette, who had been working there since last year, was currently chewing gum and flipping through a magazine, resting her elbow on the counter. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noticing the expression on Rose's face. "There's some weird guy here. He was picking out baby food and toys, but he doesn't look like a father." Emma shrugged. "So what? Maybe he's just buying for someone. I don't know. He was acting really suspiciously, and when I tried to take a picture of him, he just disappeared." Emma grimaced. "You took a picture of him? Wow. What if he's just some poor guy who doesn't have kids but wants to buy something for his niece or nephew? I don't know. There's just something off about him." Rose opened her gallery to check the photo, but the picture was gone. She clearly remembered pressing the button. She distinctly saw the camera focus, but the photo had vanished. "Damn," she muttered. "What? There's no photo." Emma rolled her eyes. "Oh, well, you probably just imagined it." But Rose knew she hadn't imagined anything. She took a deep breath and looked around. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. On the contrary, it had grown even stronger. She turned her head and saw him. The man stood by the exit, just behind the glass doors. He wasn't moving, not coming back into the store. He was simply watching her, and smiling again. Rose felt a chill run through her body. This was no coincidence. He was watching her. She needed to do something. Rose felt her fingers go cold with fear again. She turned away from the door and pretended to check the register, but her heart raced in her chest. "Is he still there?" she quietly asked Emma, not daring to turn around. Emma shrugged and reluctantly glanced toward the exit. "No, there's no one there." Rose looked again, and indeed, the man was gone. But she knew this wasn't the end. Something about his behavior was off. People don't just stand outside a store and stare at someone the way he had. It felt personal. "Maybe he just thought you were cute," Emma joked, winking. Rose didn't laugh. That's not the kind of look it was. She turned around and began checking the surveillance cameras on the monitor behind the register. She wanted to make sure he wasn't wandering around the aisles, But he wasn't there. Rose glanced at the clock. There was just over an hour until the store closed. There were hardly any customers, just a few people picking out last-minute items, but the feeling of danger didn't go away. "Listen, can you stay with me until the end of the shift?" she asked Emma. "Seriously? Because of some guy?" Emma rolled her eyes, but when she saw the look on Rose's face, she sighed. "Fine, just don't panic." Rose nodded, but she didn't feel calm. 20 minutes before the store closed, Emma went to the back to grab the last boxes for inventory. Rose was left alone at the register, methodically wiping down the surface. Then she heard a faint sound, footsteps. They were almost silent, but clear. They didn't come from the main part of the store but from some dark corner between the aisles. Rose slowly lifted her head. "Is anyone there?" Her voice echoed dully in the silence of the store. No one answered, but she knew she wasn't alone. She stepped back, trying to reach for her phone. Then she heard another sound, rustling, like someone was slowly moving toys on a shelf. Her breath caught in her throat. She cautiously peeked out from behind the register, and saw him. The man stood in the children's department. He held a small stuffed toy in his hands, slowly stroking it with his fingers, and he was smiling. Rose felt her body freeze with fear. He had been here the whole time. He hadn't gone anywhere. He was just waiting for her to be alone. What did he want? Why had he come back? Rose took a slow step back, trying not to attract his attention, but at that moment, the man looked up and locked eyes with her. His eyes were empty, cold, and he took a step toward her. What to do? Run? Scream? Rose felt her legs glued to the floor. The man took another step, and another. He was getting closer, and his smile grew wider. Suddenly, the lights in the store went out. Rose barely had time to gasp before she heard quick footsteps. He was rushing towards her. Adrenaline surged through her blood, and she stumbled back, bumping into the checkout. Her hands slid across the surface, searching for something to defend herself with. Nothing. The heavy footsteps of the man drew closer. She darted toward the service corridor that led to the storage room. Her feet slipped on the cold tiles, but she ran as fast as she could. Behind her, she heard quick, heavy footsteps. He was chasing her. Rose pulled out her phone and, with trembling fingers, pressed the screen button. Darkness. Damn, it's dead. She reached the storage room doors and shoved them open. They swung wide, and she rushed inside, nearly tripping over boxes. The doors didn't close automatically. She grabbed the handle and slammed it shut as hard as she could. A dull thud. Silence. Rose was breathing heavily, pressed against the cold metal. The man stopped behind the doors. She could hear his breathing, deep, heavy. Rose. She clenched her teeth, trying not to scream. How does he know my name? She pushed against the doors with all her strength, holding them shut, even though the handle didn't have a lock. The man didn't try to force his way in right away. He just stood there and waited. Rose realized she needed to do something, or she would be stuck here. Behind her was the dark storage room. In front of her were the doors, behind which he stood. Then she heard a creak. The man was slowly pressing against the doors, causing them to shift. She wouldn't be able to hold this for long. What to do? Her gaze darted around the storage room, and then she saw it, the emergency exit. It was a bit further down the corridor, but she could make it. The key was to get out of here before he realized her plan. Rose took a deep breath, and she suddenly pulled away from the doors and dashed forward, weaving between the shelves. Behind her came a sharp sound. The doors burst open, and the man charged after her. She ran for her life, her heart pounding in her chest. The exit was getting closer. She reached out her hand, and then a strong hand grabbed her hood, yanking her back. Rose screamed. She desperately lunged forward, feeling his heavy breath right behind her. Just a little more. She broke free, leaving the hood in his hand, and crashed into the emergency exit doors. They creaked open, and she burst outside, gasping for the cold air. A dark parking lot, empty, no one around. Rose didn't stop. She ran without looking back. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps. He was still on her tail. But just then, headlights swept across the parking lot. The man slammed to a halt. Rose lunged forward, waving her arms. Help! The car came to a sudden stop. The doors swung open. Rose? She froze. The voice was familiar. It was her manager. The man behind Rose quickly turned and dashed back into the darkness, disappearing around the corner of the store. Rose gasped, unable to believe she had escaped. What happened? Her manager ran to meet her. She trembled but managed to say only, "He was here. He was chasing me." Her manager looked around, but the pursuer was gone. Only darkness and night. Rose tried to catch her breath, leaning against the hood of her manager's car. Her hands trembled, and her head buzzed with fear and exhaustion. "Who was here? Who are you talking about?" Her manager looked at her with concern. "A man. He was chasing me. I saw him acting strangely in the store, and then he turned off the lights and ran after me." Rose spoke in fragments, glancing into the darkness. The manager frowned, quickly pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. "We need the police. Costco on the north side of town. A girl was chased by a suspicious man. Yes, she's safe, but the attacker has fled." Rose felt as if all of this was happening to someone else. Her brain was still in survival mode, unable to fully comprehend what had happened. A few minutes later, police cars with flashing lights pulled into the parking lot. Two officers quickly got out and approached them. "Are you Rose?" One of them, a tall man in a dark blue uniform, asked her. She nodded. "What happened?" In a trembling voice, she recounted everything she had seen, how the man was picking out baby food and toys, how he behaved oddly, how the lights went out, and how he started chasing her. The officers exchanged glances. "We've already received reports of a suspicious person nearby," one of them said. "The description matches your attacker. Will you find him?" Rose asked, still feeling the fear that he might return. "We'll search the area and check the surveillance cameras. If you remember any specific features of his face or clothing, that would help." Rose tried to recall. He was tall, wearing a gray jacket, with old scratches on his arm. And he had cuts on his fingers, as if he worked with his hands. The officer noted this down. The manager opened the store so the police could review the footage. A few minutes later, one of the officers came out with a serious expression. "We found him on the recordings, but it seems he knew where the cameras were located. Some areas aren't visible." Rose felt cold. "Will you find him?" "We'll keep searching. But for now, you should be careful," the officer sighed. "If he shows up again, call 911 immediately." The manager agreed to drive Rose home. She got into the car, watching as the police searched the area. She couldn't believe this had actually happened. The next day, she quit her night shift job. The police still hadn't found the man, but a few weeks later, the news reported a series of child disappearances in the city. The suspect matched Rose's description. She stared at the television screen for a long time, feeling a cold dread wrap around her. What if she hadn't escaped that night? Who knows what would have happened? The end. 23-year-old Jenny sighed quietly as she pulled up the blinds on the cash register terminal. The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. She had been working at this store for almost a year, and night shifts no longer made her anxious, just bored. The store was a small supermarket on the outskirts of town, open 24/7, but after 10 at night, only those who truly needed something came in. Truck drivers, students finishing late shifts, lonely drunks, and people who, for some reason, desperately needed chips or beer in the middle of the night. As Jenny arranged trays of chewing gum near the register, she heard the door slam in the back room. Linda, her co-worker, was getting ready to leave. "Holding down the fort tonight?" Linda smiled as she put on her jacket. "As always," Jenny replied, forcing a fake smile. Linda only worked until 11, after which the store was left in Jenny's hands along with the security guard. Though calling him a security guard was generous, Jeff, an older man in his 60s, spent most of his shift in his office, watching some show on an old TV. Linda waved goodbye and walked out. The store emptied. Jenny watched her figure disappear through the glass doors, then sighed and turned back to the shelves. After midnight, this place always felt eerie. Hour after hour passed in monotonous routine, checking inventory, balancing the register, setting out pastries for the morning delivery. Occasionally, customers came in, but most just silently grabbed what they needed and left. At 1 a.m., a tall man in a hoodie walked in. The shadow partially obscured his face, and his movements seemed unnaturally slow. He stood by the refrigerators for a long time, studying the drinks, then finally grabbed a small bottle of water and headed to the register. "Is that all?" Jenny asked, taking the bottle from his hand. The man didn't respond. He just stared at her, as if waiting for something. "That'll be $2. Silently, he pulled out some money, placed it on the counter, and didn't move. Jenny quickly rang up the sale and held out his change, but the man didn't even take the water. He just stood there, looking at her. "Everything okay?" Silence. The tension between them grew. Jenny noticed that his hands were almost too clean, as if he had just washed them or was wearing gloves. "Do you need anything else?" The man tilted his head slightly, his lips stretched into a faint smile. "See you soon, Jenny." He turned and slowly walked toward the exit. Jenny froze. She didn't remember telling him her name. Jenny froze behind the register, staring at the door that had softly closed behind the strange man. Her heart was beating slightly faster than usual. How does he know her name? She glanced down at the badge pinned to her shirt, but it only said cashier. They never wore name tags on the night shift. Maybe he was a regular? But she couldn't recall his face. Jenny sighed and closed her eyes for a few seconds. It was just the exhaustion of the night shift. People could be weird. And besides, he probably wasn't a threat. He hadn't even been holding anything besides that bottle of water. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. She reached for the register, about to sort the loose change again, when she caught movement outside the window from the corner of her eye. She stopped. The man in the hoodie was standing outside, staring straight at her. What the hell? He just stood there, motionless. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and touched the glass door. A chill crawled over Jenny's skin. She instinctively reached for the phone to call security, but at that exact moment, the man took a step back and disappeared into the darkness of the parking lot. Jenny remained frozen for a few seconds, listening to the silence of the store. He was gone. Maybe she should tell Jeff, the security guard. But no, it was just some weirdo. There were plenty of those. She tried to get back to work, but the unease wouldn't leave. 2:37 a.m. No customers have come in for over an hour. Jenny sat on the stool by the register, scrolling through her phone. TikTok was showing its usual horror story videos, but she mindlessly kept swiping, barely paying attention. Then something clicked inside the store, a soft but distinct sound. She lifted her head. No one outside the window. The aisle seemed darker than usual. Jenny waited, listening. Silence. Probably the fridge. The old dairy coolers made weird noises sometimes. She was about to look back at her phone when she heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling, somewhere toward the back of the store. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Jenny slowly stood up, trying to keep her breathing steady. "Jeff?" Her voice trembled. No answer. She reached for the button that automatically opened the register area and stepped forward. Behind her, the hum of the refrigeration units filled the air, but beneath it, there was another sound, a quiet scraping. Jenny swallowed hard. It was coming from the storage room door. There shouldn't be anyone back there. She grabbed the small flashlight from the counter. She always kept it nearby during night shifts. The beam swept over the cookie shelves, then the dairy coolers. Silence. She held her breath and moved forward. When she finally reached the storage room door, the inside was pitch black. "Jeff?" She called again, hoping to hear the old man's grumpy voice. Instead, she heard breathing, right behind the door. Jenny froze. The breathing was deep, slow. It sounded too close, like someone was standing right behind the stockroom door. Her fingers tightened around the flashlight. What should she do? Call out again? But what if it wasn't Jeff? She took a step back, and at that moment, the door jolted violently. Jenny screamed and bolted back toward the register, her heart pounding against her ribs. She nearly tripped over a basket but caught herself, her trembling hands slamming the panic button beneath the counter. "Jeff, where the hell are you?" Silence. She turned back toward the stockroom door. It was open. The darkness beyond it felt almost alive. Her head spun with fear. Jenny backed toward the exit, fumbling for her phone in her pocket. Her fingers slid over the screen, opening the emergency dialer. 921. "Don't call." The voice came from inside, from the stockroom. Deep, raspy, it made her body freeze. Something was slowly emerging from the darkness. A man's silhouette, tall, gaunt, dressed in an old gray jacket with the hood pulled up. The same man, the one who knew her name. Jenny wanted to scream, but her throat tightened. She took a sharp step back, but the man only nodded slowly. "I remember you, Jenny." Who are you?" Her voice cracked. The man tilted his head. "I've been here before. Don't you recognize me?" She shook her head, gripping her phone tighter. The man smiled. "Shame." And in the next second, he lunged. Jenny screamed, barely dodging in time. She stumbled back toward the register, knocking over a display of gum. The man grabbed her sleeve, but she wrenched free, slamming her elbow into his chest. "Help!" Her voice shattered the silence of the store. She sprinted toward the exit, but the doors were locked. How? Frantically, she pressed the unlock button. Nothing. Behind her, the man slowly pushed himself up from the floor. "You weren't supposed to be here tonight," he muttered. "It wasn't supposed to be you." Jenny kept backing away. She glanced around. Where was Jeff? Where was anyone? Then, from the corner behind the register, something creaked. She whipped around, and froze. Two more figures emerged from the stockroom. One wore a black hoodie, the other a filthy coat. Their faces were hidden in the shadows. They weren't customers. It was an ambush. Panic surged through her as she scanned for anything she could use to defend herself. "What do I do?" The man in the gray jacket was moving toward her again. "This is just bad luck, Jenny," he said softly. "Don't be afraid." She backed up, then bolted. She sprinted along the counter, hurtling over obstacles. The man lunged after her. She reached the back door, locked. Damn it! Footsteps behind her. Jenny spun, grabbed the first thing she could, a barcode scanner, and swung it with all her strength. It cracked against the man's face. He let out a muffled grunt, stumbling back. Jenny took her chance. She dashed to the emergency exit and slammed the lever. The alarm screamed through the store. She burst into the night, nearly tripping over the curb. Shouts rang out behind her. She didn't look back. Jenny ran and ran, without stopping. She didn't know who they were, didn't know what they wanted, but she knew one thing: she was never coming back to that store again.